They called him the Heron because he never moved unless he meant to. Augustin Belrose had run the docks of New Orleans for 18 years the way a heron works a shoreline, perfectly still, watching, and then, once, with total finality. At 41, he controlled the freight moving through 3 parishes, half the warehouses along the industrial canal, and a silence so complete that grown men lowered their voices just walking past his gate on Prytania Street. On a wet Tuesday in September, with the ceiling fans turning slow circles above him, Augustin Belrose could not lift his own head off the pillow. It wasn't fear. He had buried fear at 19, the night he first understood what his family's business actually cost. It wasn't the old gunshot wound in his shoulder, which ached only in changing weather like an old debt collector. It was his own nervous system, quietly rebelling after decades of perfect obedience, and the cruelty of it was that he never saw it coming. He had spent 20 years reading the men around him for the smallest tell of disloyalty. He had never once thought to read his own body. The specialists at Crescent Medical used soft words behind closed doors, autoimmune, progressive, unpredictable, because a man like Augustin Belrose did not sit in a waiting room like anyone else. They came to him. They talked about flare cycles and mobility windows while he sat across from them in a linen suit, giving them nothing but a jaw carved from patience. First it was his left hand. The hand that signed manifests, held his coffee, and once, in another lifetime, had done far worse. He noticed it over dinner, a small betrayal of a shiver, like the hand belonged to a stranger. He set his fork down and studied it the way he studied a man who had lied to him. Then came the nights. Not ordinary sleeplessness, a total siege. 40-some nights of lying in the dark listening to a house built to keep the world out, only to discover it had also locked out rest and mercy and peace. And then the mornings his legs simply declined to answer. The floor of his own bedroom became foreign ground. A man who had commanded 40 men on the water, undone by 2 knees. Outside his gates, the city noticed the silence differently now. The whispers started small and grew fast. The heron isn't moving anymore. And somewhere across the river, other men began to listen with great interest. The doctor who finally said it plainly was Dr. Marchand, a careful woman who had treated Belrose for 6 years and had never once seen him flinch until the day she told him the disease had no guaranteed ceiling, no promised floor. Only unpredictable seasons of worse and less worse, for as long as his body chose to fight it. Manageable, she told him. Not curable. Some patients stabilize for years. He nodded, thanked her, went home, and put his fist through a hall mirror because rage was the only language his grief still spoke fluently. He watched the blood on his knuckles with something close to relief. Pain he understood. Pain had rules. The staff cleaned the glass without a word. That was the other cruelty of his life. No one in that house dared ask if he was afraid. They had learned, correctly, that the question itself could end a career. Pierre Lachance came first, because Pierre always came first, 22 years as Augustin's right hand, the man who had stood beside him at his father's funeral and knew where every body in the family's history was actually buried. Pierre flew back from a business trip in Houston, sat at the foot of the bed with a leather folder, and spent 40 minutes discussing continuity structures. He had charts. He had already renamed departments in his head. Augustin listened to his oldest friend's mouth move and understood, with the flat clarity of a man reading a contract's fine print, that Pierre had been planning this for longer than the diagnosis had existed. "Get out," Augustin said, so quietly that Pierre's hands shook packing up his own papers. Camille lasted 3 weeks. 27 years old, beautiful in the specific way of things purchased rather than grown, she had shared his bed for a year and told him once, in the dark, that she would stay even if he had nothing. She cried real tears when she heard the diagnosis. He gave her that much credit. Then one morning she was gone, along with the emerald earrings from the safe in her dressing room, worth more than most people's houses. She left no note. The empty velvet box was note enough. The lieutenants didn't leave outright. Men like that never do, they loosen instead. Shipments arrived light. Percentages came up a little short, then a little more. Small enough to dismiss, deliberate enough to be understood. They were testing the fence the way animals test a fence once they suspect the current has gone out. And Dr. Marchand's predecessor, a physician named Dr. Okafor who had treated Augustine for a decade, vanished from his life entirely 1 week after the diagnosis, transferred, he was told, to a hospital upstate. Augustine didn't believe it for a second. He filed the fact away the way he filed everything, quietly, permanently, for later. Within a month, the whisper across the river had turned into a chorus with details it should never have known: the tremor, the sleepless nights, the exact texture of his decline. Belrose is finished, the city said. And a man named Anthony Duval, who ran the syndicate out of Baton Rouge and had spent 12 years afraid of Augustine Belrose, set down his glass of Sazerac with both hands so they wouldn't shake, and began, very carefully, to smile. Inside the mansion on Prytania Street, Augustine built the only wall he had left: new rules, delivered through his housekeeper, Ms. Odalise Prince. No one was to look at him for longer than 2 seconds. No soft voices. No questions. Pity would be met with immediate dismissal. Most of the household staff found other employment within a month. One woman stayed. Her name was Odette Fontenot. 32 years old, she had been cleaning the east wing of the Belrose house for 8 months, which made her, by a margin of 5 months, the longest surviving member of the staff. She arrived at 7 every morning, 6 days a week, and moved through the enormous rooms the way water moves through stone, quiet, exact, leaving everything better than she found it and taking nothing, not even his attention. She never asked personal questions. She had never once looked at Augustine Belrose for longer than 2 seconds, not because she feared his rules, but because she understood, without being told, that a wounded animal does not want an audience. She had become so completely invisible in that house that Augustine had nearly forgotten she existed, which, in that season of his life, was the highest form of safety a person could offer him. What he never bothered to ask was why she stayed. The answer was arithmetic, the kind poor mothers do at kitchen tables at midnight with a calculator and a cup of coffee gone cold. Odette had $81 in her checking account, and it had to last until Friday. Rent took more than half of everything left. The rest went to a small, safe daycare with a fenced yard and patient teachers, the kind she had chosen carefully after her husband died, because some decisions you only get to make right once. Etienne Fontenot had been a shrimper, out of Grand Isle, gone 4 years now, a storm that turned without enough warning, a boat that never made it back to the dock, a Coast Guard officer standing in her doorway at 11 at night with his hat already in his hands. The company sent a settlement check that lasted 7 months. Grief, Odette had learned, was expensive. It costs sleep, it costs softness, and then it sent you back to work anyway, because rent does not grieve with you. But Etienne had left her one thing the storm couldn't touch. His name was Theo. 6 years old, with his father's stubborn jaw and his mother's watchful quiet, and a laugh, when it came, that sounded like a bell someone had forgotten to stop ringing. He was the reason she rode the streetcar 40 minutes each way before dawn. He was the reason $81 had to be enough. Everywhere Theo went, he wore a small brass compass on a leather cord, far too big for him, looped twice around his neck. It had been his father's. He'd claimed it from the top drawer at age 4 and never given it back. It always points to what matters, he told anyone who asked. Odette never corrected him, because on the hardest mornings, she was fairly sure her son was right. The call came at 6:10 on a gray October morning while Odette was buttoning Theo's coat. The daycare had lost power overnight in a tropical storm that had grazed the coast. No lights, no heat, closed until further notice. She stood in her small kitchen doing the math poor mothers are always doing. Her neighbor was out of town. Her friend Marisol was pulling a double at the hospital. Etienne's cousin lived 90 minutes away and would be gone to work before she arrived. The emergency sitter service she'd bookmarked a year ago and never once been able to afford quoted her $85 for the day. She had 81 until Friday. Beneath the numbers sat the one fact that couldn't be negotiated. If she didn't show up at the Belrose house, she might not have a job by tomorrow. There were 40 women in this city who would take her place by Thursday. So Odette made a decision that made her hands shake as she looped the compass twice around Theo's neck. She would bring her son into the house of the most dangerous man in New Orleans. On the streetcar, with Theo warm against her shoulder, she rehearsed the rules in a whisper and knelt to his eye level once more at the service door. 3 rules, BB. You stay in the laundry room. No noise. You talk to no one. Can you do that for me? Theo nodded with enormous seriousness, the compass bumping his chin. It's a castle, he whispered. It's a house, she said. A house with rules. She set him up with a juice box, 2 crackers, and a coloring book, kissed his forehead hard enough to leave a mark, and went to work. For an hour and 40 minutes, the plan held. But Theo was 6, and 6 does not stay in laundry rooms. The handle turned easily, and beyond it stretched a hallway longer than any hallway Theo had ever seen, carpet soft as moss, ceilings so high they made him feel like he was still outside. He walked it the way explorers walk, one careful step at a time, the compass swinging with him. At the end of the hallway, he found a tall mahogany door standing open a crack. Through it, he could see a man lying perfectly still in an enormous bed, staring at the ceiling like, Theo thought, a statue of someone sad. He pushed the door open with both hands. Augustin Belrose, a man whose bedroom door had not opened uninvited in 11 months, a man guarded by cameras and iron gates and the fear of an entire city, turned his head on the pillow and found a 6-year-old boy in a too-big compass necklace standing in his doorway. Neither of them moved for a long moment. The boy wasn't looking at him the careful way the staff did, in rationed 2-second glances, and he wasn't looking at him the way the doctors did, over the tops of clipboards, measuring his decline. He was simply looking, all the way children look before anyone teaches them not to. You don't sleep, Theo said. My mama says people who don't sleep are carrying something too heavy to put down. The sentence landed in the quiet room like a stone into still water. Augustin's first instinct was the instinct he applied to everything uninvited in his territory. Remove it, swiftly, absolutely. His hand moved toward the call button on the nightstand. It stopped halfway because the boy hadn't flinched. He'd watched the hand move and hadn't stepped back, hadn't dropped his eyes, hadn't done any of the 1,000 small retreating things every human being did around Augustin Belrose. There was no fear on his face. Augustin knew fear intimately. He had built an empire from it. And there was no pity either. He knew that face too, and had banned it from his house. This child had neither. In 41 years, he could not remember the last time someone had looked at him with neither. What are you carrying? Theo asked, with the practical tone of someone taking inventory. Augustin's voice came out rough and used since the day before. More than I can put down. Theo nodded gravely, as if this confirmed a professional assessment, crossed the forbidden floor and climbed with real effort, legs too short, compass catching twice, into the leather chair by the bed. I'll help you hold it, he announced. I'm strong for my age. My papa said so. Augustine did not press the button. 11 minutes later, a white-faced Odette burst through the door, an apology already breaking loose. Mr. Belrose, I am so sorry. I'll take him right. Augustine looked at the boy in the chair, then at the mother in the doorway, and said the 4 words that changed everything. Let him stay. Please. The daycare reopened 4 days later. Odette brought Theo anyway, her stomach in knots the first morning, waiting for someone to object. No one did. Miss Odalise passed them in the hall, looked at Theo, looked at Odette, and said only, "There's a booster seat in the pantry." Otis found one somewhere. That was all. In that house, it was practically a proclamation. So, without anyone planning it, a ritual was born. Every morning at 9, Theo made his procession down the long hallway and knocked on the mahogany door, 3 knocks, always 3, delivered like a small judge passing sentence, and he never came empty-handed. The first day it was a drawing, a heron drawn in blue crayon, its legs 4 different lengths, its eye a fierce single dot. It's you, he explained. You're still a heron even when you're tired. Herons wait. That's not the same as giving up. Augustine studied it for a long time and set it on the nightstand, propped against the lamp, facing the room. It stayed there. Weeks passed, and it never moved. The second day it was a smooth gray stone from the schoolyard. Lucky ones are heavier than they look, Theo said. Augustine weighed it in his trembling palm and found, against his own expectations, that the boy was right. The third day it was a story, Theo reciting half-remembered fragments of a picture book about a fisherman who lost his lantern in a storm and had to learn to find his way home by the stars instead, getting most of the words wrong and all of the feeling exactly correct. And every day at noon, before Odette collected him for lunch, Theo performed his final office. He tugged the blanket to Augustine's chest, smoothed it with 2 small serious hands, and tucked the edges the way his mother tucked his own. Mama says a tucked-in blanket keeps the bad nights out, he explained. They look for open corners. That night, the 41st night of his illness, Augustine Belrose slept for 3 straight hours, the drawn heron keeping watch from the nightstand. It was the most anyone had given him in months. Somewhere in those weeks, Odette began carrying his lunch tray herself, though it wasn't her job. Inès Broussard, the family's chef for 30 years, watched the boy's noon ritual with the blanket for a week and then, one morning, wordlessly ladled an extra portion and slid a warm biscuit onto the tray, the way people like her say the things they can't say aloud. The change spread through the house the way real change always does, quietly, in small unplanned gestures. Otis Guillory, head of security, 6'4" and built like a levee wall, was discovered one gray afternoon on his knees in the east parlor, arms raised like claws, roaring at a volume carefully calibrated to terrify absolutely no one, while Theo, cardboard tube sword in hand, declared him the swamp monster and negotiated his surrender. Miss Odalise found them, said only, "You're needed at the gate," and mentioned it to no one, though her own rounds began carrying her past the east wing every morning around 9. And behind the mahogany door, the biggest change of all was happening quietly. Augustine got out of bed, not every day, the illness still ruled the calendar, but more mornings than not he was up, dressed in something other than a robe, sitting in the chair by the window watching the garden, where Theo was teaching an ancient hound named Gumbo to stand watch over a row of transplanted ferns. When Dr. Marchand reviewed his charts, she frowned at the numbers with something like disbelief. "Your sleep has nearly doubled." "What changed?" Augustine looked out at the garden. "Security improved," he said, and did not explain that his new head of security was 6 years old. By December, the house had a rhythm no one had designed. Inès let Theo sit on the counter kneading dough, teaching him French words for vegetables that he shouted through the halls like a boy who'd won a small war. A tin of pralines appeared on the kitchen counter every Monday, labeled in Inez's careful hand, "Pour le petit." No one commented. It was always full, and by Friday it was always empty. And every noon, in the quiet after Theo had been carried off to nap in the nursery Ms. Odalise had quietly set up, Odette brought the lunch tray herself. On the fifth Friday, as she turned to leave, his voice stopped her. "Thank you, Odette." It was the first time in 8 months he had said her name. She stood with her back to him for one long moment, because she needed it, and then turned around. "You're welcome, Mr. Belrose." Something had shifted, the way a season shifts invisible, and then all at once. In the weeks that followed, while she dusted shelves or gathered laundry, small questions began to arrive, unhurried, tucked into the quiet like coins slipped into a pocket. Where was she from? How long had she been in the city? Whether she'd stayed because she loved it or because leaving cost more than staying. Odette answered carefully at first, the way you answer a government form. Then Augustine asked follow-up questions, the thing no one had warned her about, and she found, to her own quiet alarm, that she was telling him things about Etienne she'd told no one. The storm, the phone call at 11 at night. How her husband used to sing off-key on purpose while he shaved. How Theo had inherited his exact way of standing in a doorway like he owned it. Augustine listened to all of it and asked nothing he could ever use against her. For a man like him, that was a first. In a restaurant on the Baton Rouge side of the river, Anthony Duval received an envelope over étouffée and red wine, a courier from a physician he had quietly paid, through 2 intermediaries and a laundered account, for exactly this kind of information. He read the numbers twice. Sleep doubled. Motor function improving. Ambulatory most days. Prognosis revised. Duval set the papers down with both hands, because he would not allow them to shake in front of his men. 12 years he had spent yielding streets he should have fought for, swallowing insults at sit-downs, watching his own spine bend without permission every time Augustine Belrose walked into a room. He had built his whole territory in the shadow of a mountain he'd convinced himself was dying. For 3 beautiful months, he'd finally breathed, moved his people onto the border blocks, taken 2 warehouses, a numbers operation, small careful bites of a lion he'd believed already dead. The lion was not dead. The lion was sleeping 5 hours a night and dressing for breakfast. "A dying man you can wait out," Duval said quietly, to no one in particular, to the wine going flat in front of him. "A man coming back to life, you end before he remembers how to move." Then he turned the page, and a single handwritten paragraph, worth more than every chart before it, changed the shape of everything. The recovery is not medical. There is a woman, a housemaid, a widow. She has a son, 6 years old. The boy visits him daily. The staff say Belrose is a different man. Duval read it 3 times. His fear rearranged itself, slowly, into strategy, the way it does in cornered animals of a certain intelligence. "The heron has a nest now," he said softly. "Find it." At 5:15 on a wet Tuesday, Odette and Theo left through the service gate as they did every day, hand in hand toward the streetcar stop 3 blocks off. Behind them, unhurried, a dark SUV pulled out and followed. The stop on Dauphine was 2 blocks from home. They never reached it. The vehicle rounded the corner too fast, cut across the wet street, and stopped hard against the curb, its side door already sliding open before the wheels finished moving. 3 men in dark jackets moved with purpose. Odette understood in half a second, the same part of her that had done impossible arithmetic for 4 years, the part that had perhaps been waiting her whole life for exactly this. She didn't freeze. She spun, shoved Theo behind her, and put her body between him and all three of them. "Run," she said. "Theo, run." He made 2 steps. The third man was faster. Odette fought with everything a mother has, which is more than 3 men expect. She raked one across the face and felt skin come away under her nails, drove an elbow into a second one's throat, screamed not from fear, but like a weapon aimed down the empty street at every window and doorway, until a gloved hand closed over her mouth and an arm, like a cable, lifted her clean off the ground. She kept fighting anyway at the door, inside the van. The last thing she saw before it slammed shut was the sidewalk, and on it, in the gray rain, a small brass compass on a leather cord, torn loose in the struggle, lying in the wet like something wounded. The van pulled away at exactly the speed limit. The street stood empty. Rain began to cover the brass. At 6:40 that evening, the study phone rang. Augustine was at his desk, attorney's papers half-signed in front of him. He answered on the second ring, and the room changed temperature. Bell rose. The voice was smooth, rehearsed, enjoying its one moment of leverage. "Duval. 12 years, we never really talked. My mistake. I always found you difficult to sit across from. Where are they?" A soft laugh. "For months I couldn't understand it. You dying, then not dying. My doctor sends your numbers and they keep getting better, and I ask myself what medicine you're buying that I can't. Then I learn it isn't medicine." A pause. "It's a heart. And a heart is the softest thing to squeeze. So here's the arrangement. The docs, the East warehouses, everything signed over in 48 hours, or the woman and the boy come home in pieces." Starting with the small one. The line went dead. Augustine set the phone down with a steady hand, the tremor, for once, nowhere to be found. He rose from the chair. His ruined body came up straight, vertebra by vertebra, held upright by something older than health. Otis appeared in the doorway. He'd heard the tone through the wall. "Bring the car," Augustine said. He worked through the night, the torn compass, retrieved by Otis from the wet sidewalk, dried and set on the desk, in front of him, and pulled every thread 20 years of favors had bought him. By midnight he knew the van. By 2, he knew the crew wasn't local muscle. By 4, he knew Duval had known things he had no legitimate way of knowing: the schedule, the stop, the exact shape of Augustine's new life. Which meant the leak wasn't outside the walls. By dawn, he knew Dr. Okafor had sold the file before he'd ever been quietly transferred. That thread was short. But the second thread, the schedule, the woman, the boy, the intimate geography of his private hours, led somewhere closer. It led back through 22 years of history to a man who had once sat at the foot of his sickbed with a leather folder. They brought Pierre Lachance to the house at 7 the next morning. No violence, just Otis at his door, and a long, silent drive. Pierre sat across the study desk, the same desk where he'd once spread his succession charts, and Augustine looked at him for a long time without speaking, the oldest weapon in his arsenal. Men confessed entire lifetimes into his silences. Pierre lasted 4 minutes. "You were finished," he said, voice almost pleading, almost reasonable. "Augustine, the doctors, the diagnosis, you were finished. 22 years I stood beside you. I was protecting the family. What was I supposed to do? Go down with the ship? Anyone would have. Stop. One word." The room obeyed it. Augustine leaned forward, and when he spoke his voice was quiet enough that Pierre had to lean in to receive his own sentence. "You sold me because you believed I was dying. I understand that. That's the arithmetic of men like us, and if it were only me, 22 years might have bought you a door out of this room." He paused. "But you sold them. A widow who carries soup trays. A 6-year-old with a paper sword. You handed Duval a child, Pierre." The last word landed like a verdict. "That I do not forgive." Pierre's face came apart, and he gave up the only currency he had left. "Sugar Row," he whispered. "The old warehouse on the canal. Duval's holding them there." Augustine rose. They gathered in the garage at dusk, the ones who had stayed, the ones who had never loosened. Otis. 11 others, old faces, loyal faces, men who had watched a 6-year-old teach a hound to stand guard over ferns and had quietly, privately enlisted months ago without being asked. Someone started to talk about approach routes, about territory they might take in the counterstrike. "No." Augustine looped the torn compass once around his own neck. "This isn't a war for streets. I am going to bring my family home. That's all. That's everything." Sugar Row stood at the black edge of the industrial canal, where the river smelled of rust and the streetlights had long since given up. In a small office with a taped-over window, Theo sat on a metal chair with his feet dangling far above the floor. He hadn't cried. He decided not to, the way he decided things completely. Instead, in the dark, in a voice barely bigger than breath, he was telling himself the story. Once there was a fisherman who lost his lantern, he whispered to his knees, and everyone thought he'd never find his way home. But he kept a second lantern hidden for emergencies. His chin trembled once. He fixed it. "This is an emergency." 2 rooms away, Odette sat tied to a support pipe by a grimy window, her cheeks swollen, her wrists raw from 3 hours working the rope. Through the smeared glass she watched the loading yard, the fence line, the dead streetlight, and then movement. Shadows detaching from shadows. A shape the size of a levee wall gliding along the fence. And behind it, walking upright through the rain toward the warehouse lights, a tall figure with a torn brass compass at his throat. Her heart stopped and then became a drum. What happened next happened fast. The yard lights died. A door came off its hinges. The night broke open, short disciplined bursts of gunfire answered by panicked ones. Duval's crew were border soldiers, fence testers, men hired to frighten widows, and coming through the smoke at them now were 11 loyal ghosts and a dead king walking. Their nerves snapped like winter ice. Augustine moved through his own body like a man who had repossessed it. His legs held. They held. He hit the small office first, kicked the lock loose, and there was his son by choice, small and whole, blinking against a flashlight beam. Theo came off the chair like something launched. Augustine caught him, tremor gone, arm certain, and the boy buried his face against the compass at his throat. "I knew the lantern would find me," he said into it. "I knew it. Close your eyes now. We're going home." He carried Theo out through the smoke, one arm shielding his head, and in the chaos of the main floor Otis cut the ropes at the pipe and Odette came up running, her whole ruined face turning toward light, until, behind a stack of pallets in the far corner, cornered and bleeding, Anthony Duval raised a gun with both shaking hands and aimed it at Augustine's turned back. Odette saw it whole, the barrel, the line it drew, the man holding her son. She didn't decide. There was nothing to decide. She threw herself into the line. The shot cracked the world in half. She spun and dropped, and Augustine turned and caught her before the concrete could. Theo pressed blind against his shoulder. Otis was already crossing the floor toward the pallets like the end of everything, and blood was spreading fast and dark beneath her. She looked up at him. "Don't let him see," she whispered. What happened to Anthony Duval happened quickly and without ceremony. Otis reached the pallets first and took the gun from his hands the way you take something from a child. Duval looked up from the concrete and saw Augustine Belrose standing over him, Odette's blood on his coat, the torn compass at his throat, and whatever bargain or plea 12 years of fear had prepared. It died in his mouth because Augustine's eyes held nothing. Not rage. Rage could be reasoned with. This was past it, the flat, final attention of a man taking inventory of a debt. You put a child in a locked room, Augustine said quietly. You put a bullet in the only person in this city who never wanted anything from me. Duval began to speak. No, Augustine said. Just that. He turned and walked away, carrying what mattered, and left the rest behind him. By sunrise, the Duval organization no longer existed. It didn't fall in a war. It fell like a rotten pier, all at once, in the dark, with hardly a sound the city could hear. Augustine sat on a plastic chair outside the operating room at Crescent Medical for 6 hours, under fluorescent light that spared no one. Theo slept across his lap, exhausted past fear. In his free hand, Augustine held the torn compass, washed clean in a hospital sink, still faintly bent at one edge. He had not prayed since he was 12 years old. He prayed now, clumsily, without proper words, whoever is listening, whatever it costs, and somewhere in the 4th hour, the whole ledger of his life lay open in front of him, and he saw it plainly. The docks, the warehouses, the name that made grown men lower their voices, he would sign away every brick of it, every dollar, every ounce of fear he'd ever commanded, for one thing, the steady sound of a heart monitor in the next room. At 4:12 in the morning, the doors opened. A surgeon pulled down her mask and found his eyes. She's going to make it. Odette healed at the house on Prytania Street because Augustine would not hear of anywhere else. Now it was he who came at 9 every morning, carrying the tray himself, past a kitchen full of staff who knew better than to offer. He read to her badly at first, flat and precise, like a man scanning a contract for liability, until Theo, stationed in the armchair as supervising authority, could bear it no longer. No, the storm has to sound scared, Augustine. You have to mean it. By the 3rd afternoon, his storm voice had earned Theo's grudging approval, and his heron, everyone agreed, was excellent. He had, after all, first-hand experience. It was during one of those quiet noons, after Theo had been carried off to help Ines with the dough, that Odette finally asked. Why, she started again. You've never asked me why I ran toward that gun instead of away from it. I know why, he said low. I've just been afraid to hear it out loud. She looked out at the winter garden, at the old hound sleeping under bare branches. Because I need you alive, she said, quietly, without armor, the truest arithmetic she'd ever done. I did the math in half a second. It wasn't even close. He took her hand. Her fingers closed around the left hand, the one that had trembled for months. It was perfectly still. In January, Augustine called the council together for the last time. They came to the long dining room, the lieutenants, the old faces, the ambitious ones, and found him standing at the head of the table, upright and steady, Attorney Mr. Whitfield seated beside him with a stack of documents that smelled, from across the room, like the end of an era. The docks would become a legitimate freight and logistics company, real contracts, real unions, real taxes, built on the bones of what already ran there. The gray operations wound down over 6 months, cleanly, with full severance. Every man at the table had a choice, a legitimate position at legitimate pay, or a handshake and a generous exit, and one provision, non-negotiable, read aloud in full. Lifetime support for the families of every man who had ever fallen in Belrose service, funded before any other dollar moved. It was Otis, at the end, who stayed behind and finally asked, 20 years you built this. Why give it up? Augustine looked down the long table, at the chair where Pierre had once spread his charts, at the window where winter was losing its grip on the garden. I spent 20 years building an empire so nothing could touch me, he said. Walls, soldiers, fear, all of it, so nothing could touch me. Then a 6-year-old knocked on my door 3 times, and I understood. Otis, nothing touching you was never a fortress. It was a sentence. Twelfth Night came with a warm front off the Gulf, the kind that makes New Orleans smell like jasmine even in January. In the garden, 3 people sat together under a pale winter sky, a purple and gold king cake cooling on the stone table, Theo solemnly hiding the plastic baby inside it with the seriousness of a surgeon. Odette sat on the bench, her shoulder healed, her face turned to the sun. Augustine sat beside her. He had faced senators and killers without his pulse changing. It was changing now. "I need to say something," he said, "and I'm going to say it badly, because I've never said it before." He looked at his hands, steady now, both of them. "I own the docks, buildings with my name on the deeds, and men in every parish who owe me their lives. And I lived in a house with 15 rooms, and not one of them was a home. Then a storm closed a daycare, and everything I actually needed walked in through my service gate." He met her eyes. "You and Theo made this place a home, Odette. I'm not asking you to work here. I'm asking you to stay as family for however long I have, whatever it costs to protect you both." Her eyes were bright. "You're asking late," she said, a smile breaking under the tears. "Theo's been calling you his Heron since November. And me, I did the math in half a second. It wasn't even close." Theo arrived at a dead run, cake crumbs on his chin, demanding to know what was happening, and when it was explained to him in 6-year-old terms, he nodded with the satisfaction of an architect inspecting a finished blueprint, declared that this meant Ines had to make a second king cake, and wedged himself between them while the old hound supervised from the shade. That spring, in the front hall where portraits of stern Belrose men had hung for 3 generations, a new frame went up in the place of honor, a blue crayon heron with legs of 4 different lengths and 1 fierce, unmistakable eye. Visitors sometimes asked about it. Augustine always gave the same answer: "It's the most valuable thing in this house." Everyone had waited for the most feared man on the river to take his last breath. Instead, a 6-year-old boy had taught him how to breathe again. Because here is the truth this story leaves behind. Real strength was never in the walls we build or the fear we command. It's in the terrifying, wonderful moment we let someone hold what we're carrying. The people who save us rarely know they're doing it. Sometimes they are 6 years old. Sometimes they knock 3 times, look us in the eye, and tell us the truth. And sometimes that is enough.